Philip Jansey was a man accustomed to controlling everything and everyone around him. As a lawyer for large corporations, he had built his fortune on shady deals, circumventing laws, and manipulating decisions for his own benefit. At 32, Philip was seen as a powerful and ruthless figure, someone who viewed the world as a chessboard where only the smartest won. He had reached the top of the legal market in Chicago, known for his skill in dismantling competitors and winning any case, regardless of the methods. On a Friday night during a sophisticated party at a luxurious penthouse, Philip was surrounded by businessmen and lawyers, people who, like him, thrived on moral ambiguity. Amid toasts and laughter, someone brought up the topic of relationships and marriage. Philip, always sarcastic, made a point to make it clear that he would never get involved with anyone who didn't meet his high standards. He liked women who were not only physically attractive but also added something to his social status. For him, anything different was inconceivable. It was then that Brian, one of his longtime colleagues, threw out a provocation. Brian was his partner in several dubious transactions, and perhaps the only one who dared to challenge him in public. With a mischievous smile, he approached Philip, and without ceremony proposed something that captured everyone's attention. "And what if you had to marry someone who wasn't your type, Philip? Let's say someone outside your circle of conquests. Someone like Ann Smith?" Philip laughed loudly, and all eyes in the group turned to him, waiting for his response. He cast an incredulous look at Brian, not hiding the disdain he felt for the idea. Ann Smith was a woman he knew by sight. She worked in a consumer advocacy organization and was known for her firm stance and strong personality. But what drew the most attention and for which she was most frequently commented on was her appearance. Ann was an obese woman, weighing about 350 pounds, and her unmistakable presence never went unnoticed. Philip thought the idea was absurd. "Ann Smith?" he repeated, still laughing. "I think I'd rather go bankrupt." But Brian knew exactly how to play on Philip's pride and competitiveness. He was a man who never refused a challenge, and Brian decided to use that to his advantage. He approached with confidence, his smile turning into a look of provocation, and made the bet. $2 million, Philip. $2 million if you manage to marry her and stay with her for at least 6 months. But you have to win her heart. It can't be a fake deal. I want to see you convince Ann Smith to enter into this marriage of her own free will." Brian's words echoed in the room, and a curious silence settled over the group. $2 million were not something Philip really needed, but the challenge of manipulating another person to prove his superiority, and this time, on such a personal level, stirred him. The bet represented the opportunity to show that he could win over anyone, bend any will. To Philip, Ann Smith was just another obstacle to be overcome. With a calculating smile, he reached out to Brian, sealing the bet without hesitation. "Deal, Brian. In 6 months, Ann Smith will be my wife and I'll win those $2 million, and I'll make her believe that I am the man she wants." The group burst into laughter and toasts while Philip tried to hide the excitement he felt. But what he didn't know at that moment was that Ann was no simple conquest. She was different from anything he had ever faced. Her self-confidence and inner strength would make Ann much more than a simple pawn in a game. On the following Monday, Philip Jansey was already determined to start his plan. For him, winning over Ann Smith was a calculated goal, just another target to be achieved. He spent a few hours researching her, trying to understand Ann's personality and the causes that drove her. He discovered that she was a 28-year-old woman with a solid reputation, admired for her work in defending consumers against abusive practices by large corporations, a field he usually despised. However, this characteristic sparked unexpected curiosity in him, as few people had the courage to challenge the forces that he and other powerful lawyers represented. Philip felt intrigued, and his excitement about the bet grew. He decided he would make his first contact with Ann at a community event she was organizing that week. He knew his unexpected presence would have an impact. Deep down, he wanted to see her surprised, perhaps even intimidated by him. So, on the day of the event, he wore his best suit, carefully adjusted his tie, and headed to the location with an almost theatrical air of confidence. He was used to using his appearance and demeanor to control the environment, and in his mind, winning over Anne would be no different. The event was simple and welcoming, far from the luxury and ostentation Philip preferred. Upon entering, he noticed that the room was full of people of various ages, most of them dressed casually and engaged in animated discussions about community causes. When he spotted Anne, she was at the center of the group, leading the conversation with natural energy, clearly respected and listened to by everyone present. He noticed how she gestured as she spoke, with a confidence and charisma he hadn't expected. He observed her for a few seconds, intrigued by the intensity in her eyes, until he decided to approach. Anne spotted him before he could say anything, and her surprised look did not go unnoticed. She raised her eyebrows upon seeing him, but quickly regained her composure, maintaining a firm stance. Anne already knew who he was, a famous lawyer known for defending corporate causes, and in her view representing the type of professional who contributed to the very problems she fought to solve. "Philip Jansey, at a community event?" Anne said, with an amused but clearly skeptical tone. "This is a surprise. I thought you avoided these kinds of places." Philip gave a practiced smile, trying to sound natural and friendly. "I'm trying to broaden my horizons, Anne," he replied, extending his hand in greeting. "I thought it was time to correct a flaw of mine and learn a bit more about the work you do." Anne hesitated briefly, but accepted the handshake, keeping a firm grip and direct gaze. He realized she was not a woman easily impressed. She gave him a slight smile, but not the kind of smile he was used to seeing. It was a smile from someone who saw beyond the surface, perhaps even a bit challenging. "Good to hear you're interested, Philip, but I must admit, I'm curious. What really brought you here? This doesn't seem like the kind of place where you'd usually be." He realized he would need to gain her trust with more skill than he had imagined. He decided to keep the conversation light, trying to seem approachable. "Well, to be honest, I've heard so much about you that I became curious, and I thought maybe it would be a good opportunity to understand a bit more about your causes," he said with a half smile. "Who knows, I might learn something new and maybe even contribute in some way." Anne shook her head, barely hiding her disbelief. Her eyes reflected a firmness he didn't often see. She was a woman who didn't let herself be easily swayed, and Philip was beginning to realize that it would not be as simple as he had thought. "Philip, I know your work, and I know exactly the kind of causes you defend," she said, in a direct and firm tone. "So, if you're here to impress me, you might want to try a different approach." For a moment, he felt as if she were challenging him to be honest, to drop his usual facade and show something real. But he still maintained his charming mask, determined to achieve his goal. To Philip, this challenge was just another obstacle, and he felt he needed to convince her to believe in his presence there. "I'm not trying to impress you, Anne," he replied with a touch of sincerity he wasn't accustomed to expressing. "The truth is, I'm genuinely impressed by what you do, and I think it's something that really makes a difference. I'd like to understand more about it if you'll allow me." Anne watched him as if she were trying to decipher his true intention. After a moment, she relaxed her expression slightly and gave a half smile. "All right, Philip. If you really want to understand, we can talk about it, but know that I don't have the patience for games." "Great. Neither do I," he replied with a calculated smile. The first contact had been made, and he felt that, little by little, he was finding a way through her barriers. But deep down, something about Anne was starting to intrigue him in an unexpected way. There was a genuine resilience, a strength that made him want to get to know her more deeply, and he began to question his own intentions. On the night of the dinner they arranged after their first meeting, Philip chose one of the city's most sophisticated restaurants, certain that the luxurious atmosphere would help him win Anne over. He expected the imposing setting to make her feel more vulnerable, more open to his influence. To him, luxury was a weapon, a psychological advantage in his game of manipulation. However, upon seeing her enter the restaurant, He realized Anne appeared completely unfazed. She wore a modest outfit and walked with the same confidence he had noticed at the community event. She was a woman who commanded respect through her presence, regardless of her surroundings. Philip stood up as she arrived and greeted her with a light smile, trying to appear natural. When Anne sat down, he started the conversation with a series of subtle compliments about her work, emphasizing how much he admired her dedication to community causes. He tried to gently find a point where he could connect with her, but Anne, with a keen look, seemed to diffuse any manipulation attempt with a simple, straightforward response. "So, Philip," she said after listening to a few of his compliments, "you invited me to talk about my work, and here I am. I'm curious to know exactly how you think you can contribute to causes that generally aren't part of your world." She wasn't expecting a vague response, and he knew he would have to try harder. He understood that he couldn't just use empty words. Anne wasn't the kind of person to be impressed by prepared speeches. "The truth, Anne, is that your work really intrigues me. I admire people who dedicate their lives to causes that help those in need," he replied, lowering his voice slightly. "Consumer advocacy is something I could learn more about, and I thought you would be the ideal person to show me this perspective." Anne laughed lightly, shaking her head, and her eyes reflected a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "It's funny to hear that coming from you, Philip. Most of the people I defend are on the opposite side of yours. To be honest, I'm not used to seeing someone like you genuinely interested in anything other than profit." Philip swallowed hard, and in an almost impulsive gesture he reached across the table, briefly touching her hand. It was an instinctive move, perhaps to break the tension, but he was surprised to feel the firmness in Anne's hand. She looked at him, the contact lasting only a second before they both withdrew, but Philip felt something different in that brief moment. It was a simple gesture, yet filled with unexpected symbolism. "I may not seem like the type to be interested, but perhaps I want to see things from a different angle. It's never too late to learn something new, right?" He smiled, trying to express something close to sincerity. Anne observed him closely, and he could see a glimpse of acceptance in her eyes. It was a start, a small but important step. As the days passed, Philip and Anne's meetings became almost weekly, each one further removed from the upscale restaurants he initially chose. Anne insisted on suggesting cozy cafes and walks in parks, places where she felt more comfortable being herself, without the formality and pressures that Philip's sophisticated settings imposed. And to his surprise, he accepted without hesitation. Something about Anne made him willing to loosen up his own routine. On one of these outings, they were sitting on a park bench under the shade of a tall tree. The day was cool, and the distant sounds of children playing mixed with birdsong. Anne, always willing to share stories about her work, spoke of a recent case she was especially proud of. It was the case of a small family business that almost went bankrupt due to an abusive contract with a large corporation. She told Philip about the legal battle, the night spent reviewing documents, searching for a loophole that could save the company. Philip, who would usually consider such a story a waste of time, listened with genuine interest, watching the sparkle in her eyes as she described the victory she had achieved for the business. He noticed how deeply she engaged with what she did, something he had never experienced in his own career. For him, work was a series of transactions, a battle to win the next case and add more achievements. But for Anne, each case seemed to be a personal matter. "And you really feel like this makes a difference?" he asked, with sincere curiosity. "I mean, it must be exhausting to fight against these corporations. Doesn't it wear you out?" Anne smiled, her eyes shining with a determination he couldn't ignore. "Philip, when you see the difference you can make in people's lives, the fight is worth it. Each victory, no matter how small, gives me strength to keep going. I believe the world is more than just personal success and achievements," she explained, gesturing slightly as she spoke. "Some people need help, and that's what gives my life meaning." Those words resonated deeply with Philip, and he felt a strange discomfort in his chest. He had never thought of his work as anything beyond a way to assert his value and power. But now, he wondered if there was something more. The way Anne dedicated herself to others made him feel a void he wasn't ready to confront. He looked at her in silence, and in an impulse he didn't fully understand, he reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Anne paused for a moment, surprised by the gesture. She looked at him, the contact lasting only a second, but Philip felt a connection that went beyond words. It was a simple touch, almost casual, but filled with admiration and respect. When he finally withdrew his hand, they both remained silent for a few seconds, allowing the moment to linger. "I think I've never met anyone like you, Anne," he confessed, his voice almost a whisper. "Someone who truly cares about people." She looked at him, her face softening into a restrained smile. Anne was used to superficial compliments, comments about her appearance or her work that rarely went beyond appearances. But Philip in that moment seemed to be seeing something more, something she kept for only a few. "Maybe you just need to look at things differently, Philip. Not everything has to be a power game," she replied, tilting her head slightly. "And who knows, you might find something more meaningful in what you do." He felt the weight of those words, as if they were a window into a world he had never explored. He knew he was at a crossroads. He could continue with the game, with attempts at manipulation, or he could begin to open himself up to something real. And for the first time, he considered that perhaps he wanted the latter path, even if it was unknown territory. From that day on, Philip and Anne's encounters took on a more intimate, more sincere tone. They continued to see each other regularly, and each meeting seemed to bring a new discovery. Philip began to notice small changes in his own behavior. He stopped choosing only expensive places, set aside calculated compliments and prepared conversations. Instead, he began to simply listen, letting Anne talk about her fears, joys, and the small victories she held dear. And gradually, Anne seemed to notice these changes too. She watched him with cautious interest, as if she wanted to believe he was capable of being different, but still maintained a protective distance. At times, he found himself touching her hand across the table, in a gesture of closeness that felt unforced. She didn't pull away, and he sensed that slowly, a trust was forming between them. One night, while they were at a quiet cafe, Anne shared stories of her childhood. She spoke about the challenges she faced, how she was often criticized for her weight, and how she learned to accept and value herself despite others' opinions. Philip listened intently, feeling increasingly impressed by her strength. He realized that Anne was much more than he had imagined, that there was a deep resilience in each smile and each look. "You really are different, Anne," he said after a moment of silence. "I don't think I've ever met someone with so much truth." She smiled slightly, lowering her gaze for a moment before responding. "I learned not to care about what people think, Philip. I learned to value who I am and what I do. And if you really want to know me, you'll have to learn to see beyond what you're used to." Philip knew those words were a challenge, an invitation for him to look within himself. For the first time, he felt ready to face his own barriers, his own insecurities. That night, as they walked side by side to her car, he spontaneously took her hand, as if the simple gesture could say everything he felt. She didn't pull her hand away, and they walked in silence, wrapped in a sense of closeness that went beyond words. Philip wasn't sure what was happening between them, but he felt that for the first time, he was opening himself up to something real. In the weeks that followed, Philip and Anne's meetings became more spontaneous and more frequent. At first, he had planned every step, every word, intending to win Anne over to claim the bet. But now, each encounter seemed natural, as if he had forgotten the original goal. And for Philip, this was a strange feeling that made him question not only his relationship with Anne, but the purpose of his entire life. One spring evening, while they were dining in a small bistro chosen by Anne, The atmosphere was lit by soft, relaxing light. It was the kind of place she loved, where people felt comfortable being their true selves. They were chatting about trivial things, laughing at jokes and exchanging childhood stories, when suddenly Anne grew serious. She looked at him, seemingly gathering courage before speaking. "Philip, I feel like there's something you're holding back," she said, her tone a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Sometimes you seem so present, so sincere, but other times it feels like you're hiding something." He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her question. The truth about the bet was beginning to weigh on his conscience like never before. He knew Anne deserved the truth, but he also knew that revealing the bet could destroy everything they were building. So, he decided to deflect, using a partially honest answer. "Believe me, Anne, there are many things I don't even understand about myself," he replied with a sad smile. "But for the first time, I think I'm trying to understand, and you have a big part in that." She studied his face, as if trying to decipher each detail, each unspoken word. He could tell she had a unique sensitivity to perceive his hesitations and hidden fears. And for the first time, he felt truly vulnerable around someone. Anne took a deep breath and, in an almost unconscious gesture, reached across the table and touched his hand, squeezing it lightly. Philip felt warmth spread through his body. It was a simple gesture, but one filled with understanding and support. He squeezed her hand back, holding himself back from revealing his true feelings. "If you truly want to change, Philip, that's something that only depends on you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I just hope you're honest, not only with me, but with yourself." Those words struck him deeply. He knew that at that moment the bet was the last thing on his mind. What he truly wanted was Anne's respect. He wanted her to see him as someone worthy of her admiration. But the truth remained unspoken, and he wondered if he would ever be able to reveal it without losing everything. In the days following that encounter, Philip was consumed by a restlessness he had never experienced before. Every word Anne had spoken echoed in his mind, bringing a mix of guilt and a desire to be someone better. He began to realize that the small changes he was making, initially just to impress her, were becoming part of who he was. He started turning down cases that he would have accepted without a second thought before. For the first time, he questioned the morality of the decisions he made at the office and felt uncomfortable acting with the same coldness as always. One afternoon, while reviewing a contract that favored a large corporation and harmed smaller suppliers, he stopped, with his pen suspended in the air. The image of Anne, with her determined gaze and sincere smile, came to mind, and he simply couldn't continue. He felt a growing anguish inside him, as if he were betraying not only her trust, but also the possibility of being someone different. Determined to understand what he truly felt, he invited her for a walk in a nearby park, attempting to put into words everything that was confusing inside him. When he met her, she was radiant in a simple dress, her hair flowing in the wind. When she saw him, she smiled warmly, and Philip felt his heart race. They walked side by side in silence for a few minutes until he finally decided to speak. "Anne, I feel like knowing you has made me see the world differently," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I had never questioned my work, my choices, and now suddenly I'm wondering if any of it is worth it." Anne stopped walking, turning to him with a curious yet concerned expression. "What do you mean by that, Philip?" she asked softly. He felt his throat dry, but he continued, determined to be honest. "What I mean is that, for the first time, I feel like I need to do something different. Something that isn't just about winning, but that actually means something. And that's something you've shown me, even without knowing it." Anne smiled, a smile that expressed pride and acceptance, but with a hint of caution. She came closer to him and, without thinking much, held his hand with a comforting firmness. Philip, surprised by the touch, intertwined his fingers with hers, feeling that this gesture was a silent commitment. "Philip, I know that change isn't easy, "And I know your world is very different from mine," she said, looking at him sincerely. "But if you really want to be someone different, I'll be here. But don't be mistaken. I'll need to see that in your actions, in every choice you make." He nodded, feeling a massive weight on his heart, but also a strange sense of peace. He knew that the truth about the bet still hovered between them like a shadow, but at that moment, he decided he would do everything he could to earn her respect, regardless of the consequences. As Philip and Anne's relationship deepened, the truth about the bet became an ever-present weight on his mind, like a shadow he couldn't shake. The deadline was approaching, and he knew he would soon have to make a choice: reveal everything or continue living in the lie he had created. Anne was beginning to trust him, to see the potential for genuine change, and he knew that the risk of losing that trust was growing by the day. Despite the weight of the situation, their encounters became increasingly natural and intimate. She would invite him to her home, and they would spend hours talking deeply, watching movies, or cooking side by side in her small kitchen, where the gentle evening light created an almost magical atmosphere. Philip felt that, for the first time, he was truly living, savoring simple and sincere moments. One night they were sitting on her couch, a bowl of popcorn between them, laughing at a funny scene in one of Anne's favorite comedies. Suddenly her laughter faded, and she looked at him with an intensity that made him hold his breath. He felt his heart race, sensing that there was something different in her gaze. "Philip, what really brought you into my life?" she asked in a serious yet soft tone. "Sometimes I feel like there's something you haven't told me. Something important." He felt his stomach churn. The question hung in the air like a sort of test, an opportunity to finally confess everything. He looked at her, taking in every detail of her face, and felt a wave of guilt and fear. The bet loomed, an invisible barrier between them, and he knew this was the moment he could be honest. But instead of confessing, he looked away, letting silence fill the room. After a few seconds, he took a deep breath and answered cautiously, I think you make me want to be a better person, Anne. Someone I might not have been for a long time." She watched him without blinking, as if trying to decipher his words. Philip noticed the restrained sadness in her eyes, and he knew that in some way she sensed he was still hiding something. But Anne was patient and decided to respect his timing, simply holding his hand gently and offering an encouraging smile. "I just hope you know that I'll be here," she said, intertwining her fingers with his. "But Philip, I'll need the whole truth if I'm ever going to fully trust you." Those words echoed in his mind over the following days. Philip knew he couldn't keep hiding the bet, but he feared the devastating impact the truth would have on them. He found himself thinking of the bet as a chain tying him to his former self, to a world where he had to win at any cost, regardless of the consequences. Finally, the night came when he knew he would have to reveal everything. He invited her to dinner, but this time he didn't choose a luxurious restaurant or a sophisticated spot. He picked a small Italian restaurant in the city center, a cozy, intimate place where they could talk without interruptions. Anne arrived a little later than he did, and when he saw her enter, he felt a mix of relief and fear. It was as if he were about to lose something he hadn't even realized he needed. They ordered dinner, and as they waited, a heavy silence settled between them. Anne could sense the tension in the air and knew that Philip was about to say something important. After a long sigh, he finally found the courage to start. "Anne, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you from the beginning." She nodded, keeping her gaze fixed on him as if she knew this moment would come. Philip took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but feeling like nothing could truly soften the impact of what he was about to say. "When I approached you for the first time, it was because of a bet," he confessed, his voice low and filled with guilt. "A friend challenged me to win you over, to marry you for at least 6 months. The idea was to prove that I could do it. But everything changed." Anne's expression remained impassive as she processed what he had just said. Philip felt his heart ache as he saw the brightness in her eyes slowly fade, replaced by deep sadness. "So this whole time, you were just playing with me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, filled with a pain he would never forget. "No, Anne. At least not anymore," he replied, desperate for her to understand. "In the beginning, yes, it was just a game. But after, I fell in love with you. I truly fell in love, and everything I've done in the past few months has been for you, because I wanted to be someone worthy of your love." She remained silent, looking away as a tear rolled down her face. Philip felt helpless, unable to undo the hurt he had caused. Anne wiped away the tear, trying to maintain her composure, but her expression showed the depth of her disappointment. "You should have told me sooner, Philip," she said, her voice trembling. "I believed in you, trusted that you were trying to be someone better, and now, I don't know what to think anymore." Philip tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away as if his touch hurt her. The silence between them was heavy, and he knew that every word he tried to say seemed insufficient. "I know I messed up. I know I was cowardly and selfish. But I'm being honest now, Anne, and I'm willing to do anything to prove it, anything." She looked at him for a long moment, and Philip saw the conflict in her eyes. It was as if she were torn between hurt and hope, between pain and the possibility of forgiveness. "This isn't something I can just forget, Philip," she said, her voice low and hesitant. "I'll need time, a lot of time to process this." He nodded, accepting her words as a fair sentence. He knew that the trust they had built was crumbling, but he also knew he couldn't give up. She was everything he wanted, everything he needed, and he was willing to fight to win her heart back, even if it took a lifetime. "I hope that one day you can forgive me," he said sincerely. "And I'll wait for that, as long as it takes." Anne slowly got up, still without looking at him, and left the restaurant, leaving Philip alone with an emptiness that seemed to consume everything around him. He knew he had lost something priceless, but he also knew he had to keep going. He had to prove to her that despite his mistakes, he could be someone better. The days following the revelation of the truth were a torment for Philip. He felt an unbearable emptiness, something he had never experienced before, even in the most difficult situations of his professional life. Anne was absent, and he felt the weight of her silence as a punishment. He tried calling, sent messages, but all he received was cutting silence. He knew that the trust they had started to build was shattered into pieces, and he might never be able to rebuild it. However, a part of him, the part that Anne had awakened, refused to give up. Philip realized that she was the first true love of his life, the first person who had genuinely challenged him to be a better person. And now, he was willing to fight, to prove that he was more than a selfish manipulator. One day, while reflecting on a way to redeem himself, he remembered something Anne often said: "Small actions have the power to change the world." Determined, he began making changes, not just in his personal life but in his career, abandoning cases that involved abusive practices and starting to work for the benefit of small business owners and harmed consumers. The exact opposite of what he had always done. The first steps were difficult. Many of his partners and colleagues questioned him. Some even mocked his sudden morality. But Philip remained firm in his decision. He wanted Anne to see that, even in her absence, he was committed to being someone better. And he hoped that in time, she would see that. About 3 months after their last meeting, Philip received an unexpected email from Anne. His heart raced as he saw her name on the screen, and he read the message with a mixture of hope and nervousness. "Philip, I've heard about the changes you're making. I'm seeing you take on cases I never imagined you would. I won't lie, it was a surprise. Maybe I underestimated you. Shall we talk? Tomorrow at the cafe near the park at 6 p.m. Anne." The next day seemed to drag on as Philip prepared for the meeting. He was nervous like never before, mentally rehearsing what to say, but deep down, he knew that no words would be enough. He needed her to see the changes, to feel that he was truly there, committed. At the agreed time, he arrived at the cafe and sat at one of the tables in the back. When Anne entered, he felt a blend of joy and apprehension. She looked as beautiful as he remembered, and her expression, though serious, seemed lighter than the last time. "Anne, thank you for coming," he said, his voice filled with emotion. She sat across from him, her eyes studying him carefully. "I came because I wanted to understand what has really changed in you, Philip. I wanted to see if this change is sincere," she replied without mincing words. "I must admit, I'm surprised by what I've seen. The cases you've taken on. I never imagined you'd take this path." Philip took a deep breath, knowing this was his moment to open his heart. "I understand why you doubt me, Anne. I know I deserve that. But every decision I've made since you left was inspired by what I learned from you," he began, keeping his gaze steady on hers. "You showed me that someone's worth isn't just in what they achieve, but in what they give back to the world. And that's who I want to be, for you and for myself." She remained silent, observing him with an unreadable expression. Philip continued, feeling the need to lay everything bare. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I know that will take time. But I love you, Anne, truly, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to regain your trust. Every change I've made was to become someone worthy of you, someone you can respect." Anne looked at him for a few moments, then looked away, as if she needed a moment to process what he had just said. Philip felt his heart tighten, fearing that it still wasn't enough. "Philip, I believe people can change, and I know you're really trying," she said, her voice softer. "But trust isn't something that can be rebuilt easily. There are still wounds, and it takes time to heal them." He nodded, understanding the depth of the hurt he had caused. He knew he would have to wait, that he needed to be patient and respect her time. But the mere possibility of winning her back gave him the strength to keep going. "I hope that one day you'll be able to see me as someone you can trust," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I'm not giving up on you, Anne. I'll prove every day that I'm a different man." She smiled slightly, a smile that held a mixture of tenderness and caution. After a few seconds, she reached across the table and took his hand, a simple gesture, but one laden with meaning. Philip felt a comforting warmth in her touch, as if somehow that gesture was a silent promise of hope. "Let's take it one step at a time, Philip," she replied gently. "I'm not ready to give everything back to you yet, but I'm willing to try." They stayed silent for a few moments, just holding hands, without needing to say more. The journey ahead would be long, filled with ups and downs, but both knew that, with patience and sincerity, they could rebuild what they had lost. After months of rebuilding and growing together, Philip and Anne decided it was time to take a bigger step in their relationship. Philip's marriage proposal, made simply but with deep emotion, marked the beginning of a new chapter. When Anne accepted, they both knew they were ready to build something solid and true, free from any troubled past. For the ceremony, they chose something intimate and low-key. Instead of a glamorous event, as many might have expected from Philip, they picked a small chapel in the countryside, surrounded by a garden filled with colorful flowers and a welcoming atmosphere. The guest list was limited to only close family and a few friends, people who truly understood the journey they had taken to reach this moment. On the morning of the wedding, Philip felt a mix of nerves and emotion. He looked at himself in the mirror, adjusting his suit, recalling all the moments they had shared, the first conversations, the laughter, the challenge of regaining her trust. He knew this day represented more than a formal union. It was the celebration of a love forged with patience, understanding, and transformation. At the same time, he also felt the weight of commitment. But now, unlike before, he was ready to be a devoted and genuine husband. When Anne entered the chapel, Philip felt his breath catch for a moment. She wore a simple, elegant white dress that draped gently around her, highlighting her radiant face and the sincere sparkle in her eyes. Anne, always authentic and self-assured, walked down the aisle with a serene smile, holding a small bouquet of daisies and sunflowers, her favorite flowers. Her steps were steady, as always, but there was a touch of vulnerability and emotion he hadn't seen in her before. Philip felt tears fill his eyes as he watched her approach. He knew she was the woman who had completely changed his worldview, who had made him want to be a better person. When Anne stopped in front of him, he held her hands tenderly, feeling overwhelmed by a happiness he couldn't describe. In that moment, he knew he had found his true purpose. The officiant began the ceremony, and when it was time for the vows, Anne looked at him with a mix of love and seriousness. Her words were simple but filled with meaning. "Philip, you've shown me that even the most lost souls can find their way back. I choose you, not for who you were, but for the man you decided to become, for the strength you found to change. Today, I promise to stand by your side, in every joyful moment and every challenge we face. And above all, I promise to continue being myself, because I know that's how you love me." Philip, overcome with emotion, swallowed hard as a tear rolled down his cheek. He had never been a man to openly express his feelings, but in her presence, there was no room to hide who he was. "Anne, you are the person who taught me the value of truth, courage, and love. I never thought I'd find someone like you, someone who could see more in me than I saw in myself. Today, I promise you my sincerity, my commitment, and my heart. I want to be the man you deserve, and I'll stand by your side every step of the way, forever." With these words, they both felt that the journey had become a destination. They exchanged rings while gazing deeply at each other, and when the officiant declared them husband and wife, Philip leaned in for a gentle, respectful kiss, full of tenderness. The simple, brief ceremony was all they needed to seal the new life they were building together. As they left the chapel, walking side by side through the garden, friends and family gathered around to congratulate them, their smiles and words of support surrounding them. Philip felt a genuine happiness that seemed to fill every corner of his soul. After the ceremony, the reception was held in the chapel's garden, with round tables decorated with wildflowers and lights hanging from the trees, creating a warm and light atmosphere. The celebratory mood was perfect for the occasion, without the excesses and formalities that once characterized Philip's events. Here, everyone was present for love, and each smile was an expression of support for the union that Anne and Philip had built. As the guests enjoyed the evening, Anne and Philip stole a quiet moment together in a corner of the garden, away from the noise of the party. Sitting on a wooden bench under a tree, Anne rested her head on Philip's shoulder, and he intertwined his fingers with hers. The silence between them was comfortable, and their presence alone was all they needed to understand that they were finally at peace. "Remember how it all started?" Anne murmured with a faint, ironic smile. Philip chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Yes, I remember it well," he replied, stroking her hand. "And I never imagined that beginning would be so important. Of all the bets I've ever made, this was the only one that truly mattered." Anne looked at him, her smile turning into a deep, loving gaze. "This wasn't a bet you won, Philip," she said with a playful tone. "This was a bet we both won, because more than anything, you proved to me and to yourself that you were capable of change." He smiled, feeling overwhelmed by a sense of gratitude. He knew Anne was the reason for his transformation, and that without her, he would likely never have found meaning in his life. He hugged her tightly, and there, under the starry sky, he knew he didn't need anything more. Their honeymoon was peaceful and romantic, a precious time spent together traveling through small towns and exploring cozy places without any rush. Every moment together felt like a discovery, and Philip felt that every conversation and every smile from Anne was a gift he could never take for granted. He was living a true love, something he had never experienced before. About a month after the wedding, Anne started feeling different, noticing small signs that piqued her curiosity. She decided to take a pregnancy test, and to her joy and surprise, the result was positive. She and Philip were expecting a baby, or as they later found out, two. At the first appointment with the doctor, the couple was ecstatic when the ultrasound revealed they were having twins. Philip, with tears in his eyes, held Anne's hand, unable to contain his overwhelming happiness. However, the doctor warned them about certain risks, particularly due to Anne's weight and the unique circumstances of a twin pregnancy. The pregnancy would require strict care and constant monitoring. Anne and Philip prepared for the challenges ahead, both willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure the baby's safety. Philip became even more attentive, accompanying her to every appointment, helping her follow a special diet, and making sure she rested whenever needed. In the following months, Philip and Anne lived with anticipation and caution, but also with immense joy. They were building a family, and each moment of waiting was a step closer to fulfilling that dream. As the pregnancy progressed, Anne and Philip prepared with both anticipation and caution for the arrival of their twins. Each doctor's visit confirmed the health of the babies, but Anne's weight continued to be a factor of risk. Philip doubled his dedication, reorganizing his commitments and stepping away from work as much as possible to accompany her every step, helping her follow a specialized care routine and adapting their home for her needs. As the birth date approached, they lived in a constant state of expectation. At each ultrasound, they watched in fascination as the babies moved, their small hearts beating in perfect sync. Despite the risks, Anne remained steadfast in her determination to carry the pregnancy to term, committed to giving her children the love and strength that had always been central to her life. The couple spent entire nights planning the future, choosing names and imagining what life would be like once the little ones were by their side. Philip, once known for his cold and pragmatic demeanor, surprised even himself by talking about unconditional love and the responsibility of raising children. The shift in his outlook was noticeable, and Anne, observing his growing affection and care, felt grateful for each moment of transformation they had shared. As the weeks passed, Anne's care routine intensified. Philip insisted on preparing her meals according to the doctor's recommendations, and she often laughed as she watched him, a man once distant from the kitchen, carefully chopping vegetables and measuring ingredients with a focus he had never shown before. "Who would have thought, right?" Anne joked, watching Philip as he prepared dinner with a look of concentration. He smiled, drying his hands on a dish towel before coming over to her. "All of this is to make sure you and the babies stay well," he replied, holding her hand lovingly. "There's nothing I wouldn't do for you all." Philip felt a deep connection to the pregnancy, as if the wait for the twins was transforming him internally with each passing day. He began to realize that everything he had fought for in the past, every achievement, every dollar earned, was insignificant compared to what he felt now. The family they were forming was his greatest victory, something he had never imagined was possible. And for Anne, the journey of motherhood alongside Philip was a sign that, despite all obstacles, they had found something genuine and true. When the third trimester arrived, Anne began feeling the strain of pregnancy more intensely. Moving around became harder, and her nights were interrupted by discomfort and constant worry. Philip remained tireless, helping her get comfortable, adjusting pillows and spending sleepless nights by her side, holding her hand to reassure her that he was there. In the early hours of a chilly autumn morning, Anne woke up with intense pain. She called out to Philip, who immediately got up and saw the seriousness of the situation. Anne was going into labor earlier than expected, and seeing her face, Philip felt a mixture of fear and determination. He knew this would be the hardest moment of their lives, but he was ready to face it with her. Anne was rushed to the hospital, where the medical team immediately began preparing for an emergency delivery. The obstetrician explained to Philip that due to Anne's weight and the position of the babies, a C-section would be necessary to ensure everyone's safety. The tension in the room was palpable, and Philip held Anne's hand firmly, whispering words of encouragement as she prepared for the procedure. "It'll all be fine, Anne. We're in this together," Always, he said, trying to give her the reassurance she needed. She looked at him with a trembling smile, her face marked by pain and exhaustion, but also by the trust she had in him. "Philip, I just want our babies to be okay. I trust you, and I know you'll be here." Philip nodded, unable to hold back his emotion. He accompanied her as far as he could to the operating room, where the doctors directed him to wait outside. Even though he knew everything possible was being done to ensure Anne and the baby's safety, he felt his heart tighten as he watched the door close, separating him from her. He sat in the waiting room, hands trembling, thoughts filled with anxiety, each second seeming like an eternity. After over an hour of waiting, one of the doctors finally came out and approached Philip, who immediately stood, his face anxious for news. "Mr. Jansey, we have good news," the doctor began with a reassuring smile. "The babies were born healthy and your wife is in recovery. The delivery was complicated, but everything went well in the end." Philip felt a wave of relief so intense that he could hardly contain his tears. He thanked the doctor, feeling an enormous weight lifted from his chest. Moments later, he was allowed into the recovery room, where Anne lay resting, still under the effects of the anesthesia, but conscious enough to recognize him. When Philip entered, holding 2 small bundles of blue blankets, Anne smiled through tears, reaching out for the babies. He carefully handed one to her and, holding the other, sat beside her on the bed, both of them cradling their children. The twins were quiet, their eyes closed, and the couple gazed at them with deep, indescribable admiration. "Philip, they're perfect," Anne murmured, her eyes fixed on the babies' faces. "I can't believe we're living this." Philip smiled, gently touching her face. "They're perfect because they have you as a mother, and because somehow we managed to overcome everything. I couldn't be more grateful, Anne." She nodded, eyes brimming with tears as she held the little ones close. Philip, overwhelmed by a profound love, looked at her, remembering everything they had endured to reach this point. "Anne, I never imagined I'd feel anything like this," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. These babies, this family, I would give everything for you all." She smiled sweetly and squeezed his hand in a gesture of love and gratitude. "Who would have thought it all started with a bet?" she joked, laughing softly. Philip shook his head, laughing with her, his heart filled with a happiness he had never imagined. "And who would have thought this would be the most important bet of my life?" he replied, kissing her forehead. "Thank you, Anne, for everything, for believing I could be more." In the days and weeks following the twins' birth, Philip and Anne dove completely into life as parents. The nights were short and filled with constant care, but every moment was rewarded with the love they felt as they gazed at their children. The twins, who had brought so much meaning to their lives, became the focus and purpose of all their efforts. Their home now pulsed with a new energy. Philip, once entirely career-focused, now organized his time to be present for every moment. He devoted himself wholeheartedly to helping Anne, changing diapers, preparing bottles, and attending every doctor's appointment for the babies. For him, this was the new success, and Anne's smile and their children's trusting eyes were his greatest achievement. Anne, in turn, adapted to the new routine with the strength and resilience that always defined her. Despite the challenges and exhaustion, she felt a happiness and peace she had never imagined. Philip by her side was a steady presence, a partner who, day by day, proved that the love they shared was real and enduring. In moments of exhaustion, he would hug her and whisper words of encouragement, reminding her they were in this together, facing every challenge as a team. One morning, as they prepared breakfast and watched the babies sleep in their cribs, Philip turned to Anne with a thoughtful look. "You know, Anne, I never thought I could be this happy with such a simple life," he said with a genuine smile. "For someone who always chased accomplishments and status, this life feels like a dream." Anne laughed softly, reaching out for his hand. "Maybe the secret is knowing what really matters, Philip." She squeezed his hand. "And I'm happy you've found that we've found it together." Philip pulled her into a hug and they stood there in silence, savoring the peace of that moment. The months flew by, and soon the twins began taking their first steps and babbling their first words. Philip and Anne were always close by, ready to encourage and celebrate each milestone. For Philip, watching his children grow alongside Anne was a privilege he would never take for granted. He made sure to be actively involved in their lives, taking them to the park, telling them stories, and teaching them the little things he had learned about life. One sunny Sunday, the couple took the twins for an outdoor outing. Sitting on the grass with the babies crawling around, Philip watched everything with a serene expression, his heart filled with joy. Anne, by his side, smiled as she saw him so engaged with the children. "I never thought you'd adapt so well to this life," she commented with a playful tone. "You're becoming a true family man, Philip Jansey." He laughed, shaking his head. "I never imagined this would be what I wanted most in life, Anne. But with you, I've learned that there are things much more important than power and status." He looked at her fondly, holding her hand. "I want our children to grow up knowing that love and truth are the greatest accomplishments we can achieve." She nodded, touched by his words, feeling that every sacrifice they had made to build this life had been worth it. On the twins' first birthday, Philip organized a small celebration at home, surrounded by close friends and family. The party was simple but filled with love and affection. As he watched his children smiling and playing, he felt a deep gratitude, something he had never experienced before. He was surrounded by love, and it was all thanks to Anne, the woman who had believed in him and given him a chance to be a better man. As evening fell and everyone started to leave, Philip led Anne into the backyard, where the golden light of the setting sun illuminated her face. He held her hands, his gaze filled with tenderness and emotion. "Anne, I know we've said it all before, but I need to say it again," he began, his voice soft. "You saved me, gave me a new life, and every day I wonder how I got so lucky. Thank you for everything, for every second, every smile. For you, for our children, I'd give everything." She smiled, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Philip, everything we've done, everything we've built, it's because of your change, your love." She squeezed his hand. "I'm so happy we bet on each other, because in the end, we won so much more than anyone could have imagined." Philip nodded, his heart filled with absolute certainty. He pulled her into an embrace, and there, under the night sky, they knew they had finally found the true meaning of life. As Philip and Anne watched their children play and the sky was painted with the colors of sunset, they both felt that everything they had gone through had been necessary to reach this moment, together, stronger and more united than they had ever imagined. Every challenge, every choice, and even the initial bet had transformed into a story of love, resilience, and growth. What do you think? Did Anne make the right choice in forgiving and marrying Philip? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinion. Your participation is very important to us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more narratives like this one. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.